When Joe DiMaggio drew his final breath in 1999, he was clutching a tattered wool jacket that hid a 12-word secret from Marilyn Monroe the world was never supposed to find. What she promised him in those faded blue lines would redefine their tragedy and prove that their love never truly ended. The telephone in Joe DiMaggio's San Francisco home didn't just ring that August night. It wailed like a lonely ghost in the dark of 2 o'clock in the morning, carrying a secret that Joe would keep locked away for the next 37 years. Joe sat up in silence, his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing with a terrifying certainty that only one person in the world would be calling him at this hour. He didn't know yet that this conversation would be the foundation of a mystery that would haunt Hollywood for decades, or that a 12-word note was about to be born in the shadows of a trembling voice. When he picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end was a fragile whisper. It was her. It was his Marilyn, but the golden goddess the world saw on the screen was nowhere to be found in that trembling hello. She wasn't calling as a movie star. She was calling as a woman who had reached the edge of her strength, looking for the only lighthouse she ever truly trusted. "Joe, please, I am so tired of being her," she whispered, her voice cracking under a persona that had become a prison. Joe listened to the ragged breath on the other end, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone, feeling the miles between them like a physical weight. She told him she was scared, that the walls of her house in Brentwood felt like they were closing in. In that moment, the years of their public fights and the messy divorce vanished. Joe simply closed his eyes and promised her that he was coming, that he would always come when she called, no matter how much time had passed. She whispered that she had a secret, something she couldn't say over a recorded line, something that would change the course of their lives if he would just meet her one last time. Joe felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of urgency that moved him to his feet before the conversation was over. They made a plan to meet at a secluded stretch of the Pacific coast, a place where the cameras couldn't find them. He could hear the faint sound of a sob, followed by a soft thank you that sounded like a prayer. He told her to hold on, to just keep breathing, and that he would be there before the sun rose. As he hung up, the silence of the house felt louder than ever, thick with the scent of a tragedy he was determined to prevent. He grabbed his keys and his favorite wool jacket, the one she always said made him look like a hero, and walked out into the cool night air. He knew that this wasn't just another reconciliation. This was a rescue mission for a soul that was fading away. As Joe sped toward the coastline, the headlights cutting through the thick California fog, he had no idea he was driving toward the most important conversation of his life. Little did he know that the woman waiting for him in the mist held a message that would haunt his dreams for the next 37 years. The battered Ford Thunderbird sat idling at the edge of the world, its headlights casting weak yellow beams into a sea of rolling white fog. Through the windshield, a woman sat huddled in the driver's seat, her face obscured by a silk headscarf and dark glasses. Joe pulled onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch of the rocks beneath his tires sounding like thunder in the stillness of the pre-dawn hour. He stepped out into the biting Pacific air, the scent of brine and eucalyptus filling his lungs as he walked toward that lone vehicle. When he reached the door, he didn't knock, he simply waited. Slowly, the window rolled down, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he looked into those famous blue eyes. They weren't sparkling with the manufactured fire of a studio lighting rig. They were red-rimmed and weary. "Joe, I just want to go home," she murmured, her voice barely audible. This was Norma Jeane, the girl who had spent her life looking for a home, appearing now as if she had finally run out of places to hide. She looked at Joe, her lower lip trembling just enough to betray the calm mask she was trying to wear. The only sound was the rhythmic, haunting crash of the waves against the cliffs below. Joe reached a hand toward her, his fingers brushing against the cold glass, and the sight of his steady strength seemed to break a dam inside her. She didn't get out of the car at first. She simply leaned her forehead against the steering wheel and let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a flickering heartbeat. Joe walked around to the passenger side and slipped into the seat beside her, still wearing that same wool jacket, the small cabin instantly filling with the faint, nostalgic scent of her perfume. It was a space that felt disconnected from the mansions of Hollywood. It was just two people in a metal box at the edge of the continent. He noticed how thin she had become, how her hands seemed to flutter like trapped birds in her lap. She reached out and took his hand, her skin feeling like parchment, and squeezed it with a desperate force. She told him that she had driven for 3 hours just to find a place where the air felt clean, a place where the insistent flashbulbs of the paparazzi couldn't reach her. In this misty sanctuary, the Marilyn the world owned was gone, replaced by a frightened woman who was spiritually absent, even as she sat right there beside him. She looked out at the churning water and whispered that she felt like the tide was pulling her out further than she could swim. Joe tightened his grip, promising her that as long as he was standing on the shore, he would never let her sweep away into the dark. But as she turned to look at him, a strange, knowing smile touched her lips, a smile that held a secret more powerful than any promise. In the cramped sanctuary of that car, Joe realized the woman sitting beside him was no longer the untouchable icon who had captured the imagination of millions. She was a woman stripped of her armor, looking at him with a raw honesty that made the breath catch in his throat. It was the look of someone who had finally stopped running and realized that the only person who ever truly saw her was the man she had pushed away. Joe felt a wave of regret for all the months and years they had spent in a cold war of pride. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had swung bats and won championships, and realized they had been useless when it came to holding on to the one thing that mattered. He told her, his voice thick with emotion, that he was sorry for being so rigid, for wanting to lock her away when all she needed was for him to walk beside her. Marilyn didn't cry then. Instead, she let out a soft, melodic laugh that was more heartbreaking than any sob, a sound carrying the weight of 1,000 what-ifs. She confessed she had spent her life trying to be what everyone else wanted, a child, a star, a fantasy, until she had forgotten how to be herself. "I forgot who Norma Jeane was, Joe," she whispered, leaning closer until their foreheads touched. She admitted that, in her darkest hours, this was the only face she saw in the mirror of her mind. They sat there in the gray light, two people who had reached the pinnacle of fame only to find it was a very cold and lonely peak. The conversation turned to the simple things they had shared, the quiet mornings with coffee and the way the sun used to hit the floor of their apartment in New York. It was a sentimental journey through a past that felt like a different lifetime, a time before the studio contracts had turned their love into a circus. Marilyn leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a few minutes the tension drained out of her body, replaced by a peace that had been absent for too long. Joe made a vow right then that he would spend the rest of his days making up for the time they had lost. He told her that they could start over, that they could disappear to a place where no one knew her name. She listened with a wistful expression, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could see a future that was just out of reach. There was a sense of profound catharsis in their shared honesty, a feeling that the clouds of their past were finally being drawn out by the salt air. As the first hint of blue began to bleed into the dark sky, Marilyn sat up and reached into the pocket of her heavy coat, her movements slow. She looked at Joe with a solemnity that made his heart skip a beat, her fingers trembling as they brushed against a small, folded piece of paper. She whispered that she had written something down because she was afraid her voice would fail her. If this story of a love that transcends fame is touching your heart, please take a moment to subscribe. We are dedicated to honoring the beautiful hidden moments of legends like Marilyn, and your support helps us keep these memories alive. We have so much more of this secret night to share with you. The small piece of yellow legal paper was wrinkled and soft, as if it had been folded 1,000 times in the quiet hours. As Marilyn held it out, her fingers brushed against Joe's palm, and he could feel the faint tremor that told him more than her words could. Joe took the note with a reverence usually reserved for ancient artifacts, his large hands shaking as he smoothed the creases. The handwriting was unmistakable, looped and graceful, yet hurried, as if the person writing was afraid the thought might vanish. There were small smudges on the paper where teardrops had fallen and dried, blurring the ink but leaving the message clear. As he read the message she had penned in the solitude of her bedroom, his breath hitched. She hadn't written about her career or her fame, she had written a message from one soul to another, a plea for a sanctuary that only he could provide. Joe stared at the ink, memorizing the way she crossed her T's, realizing that this wasn't just a letter. It was a bridge thrown across a vast canyon, a final attempt to reach the only man who had ever truly loved the girl behind the mask. He looked up from the paper to find her watching him, her breath hitching as she waited for his reaction. He saw the vulnerability there, the raw fear of a woman who had given everything to a world that took and took until there was nothing left but this scrap of paper. Joe felt a surge of protective fury toward everyone who had ever hurt her, followed by a profound tenderness that brought a sting to his eyes. He realized that for all the stadiums of cheering fans, she had been starving for the simple truth contained in those words. He didn't say a word at first. Instead, he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the breast pocket of his wool jacket, right over his heart, promising that it would never leave his side. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was sacred. They were no longer the Yankee Clipper and the blonde Bombshell. They were just Joe and Norma Jeane, two weary travelers who had found each other again in the storm. Marilyn reached out and traced the line of his jaw with her thumb, a ghost of a smile finally touching her lips as she saw the devotion in his gaze. She whispered that she had been carrying that note for 3 weeks, waiting for the moment she felt brave enough to show him what she really wanted. It was a confession that set the stage for a promise so powerful it would echo through the decades, long after the world thought their story had concluded. Marilyn turned toward Joe, her gaze locking onto his with a searing intensity that pushed back the encroaching morning mist. She took a deep breath, and in a voice that was no longer a whisper but a steady, solemn vow, she told him she was ready to leave the bright lights behind for good. "Wait for me," she said, her eyes glistening with a sudden hope. She promised that as soon as she finished her final week of obligations in Los Angeles, she was going to pack a single suitcase and drive north until the hills of Hollywood were nothing but a memory. They began to talk about the future with the frantic, beautiful energy of two people who had just discovered a hidden door out of a burning building. Joe took her hands in his thumbs stroking her knuckles as they planned a life that felt like a quiet dream. They spoke of a small house near the water, of long walks where no one would ask for an autograph, and of a wedding ceremony so private only the birds would be witnesses. Marilyn's laughter bubbled up, a genuine sound that Joe had feared was gone forever. They even picked a date, August 8th, 1962, a day that they whispered to each other like a secret password. It was a pact of pure redemption, a second chance that felt so solid Joe could almost see the golden ring on her finger. He told her he would wait 100 years, but she squeezed his hand and insisted she wouldn't make him wait a second longer than next Saturday. The tragedy of that moment lay in the absolute purity of their belief that they had finally won. In that salt-aired sanctuary, the darkness of the past few months seemed to evaporate, replaced by a plan for a life that was finally their own. Marilyn looked at the clock and back at Joe, a playful spark returning to her eyes as she told him she had already picked out the dress she would wear for their beginning. She described the simple white fabric and the way she wanted to wear her hair natural, without the heavy sprays of the studio. Joe felt a peace settle over his heart that he hadn't known since his days on the diamond, a feeling the world was finally aligning in their favor. They were building a fortress of hope out of nothing but whispers, convinced their love was a shield strong enough to protect them. But as the sun began to burn through the fog, the reality of the world started to seep back in. Marilyn glanced at the horizon with a flicker of anxiety, knowing her time in this paradise was running out. The golden light of a new day began to spill over the jagged cliffs, signaling that their secret hours had come to an end. Marilyn looked at the rising sun with a pained expression, as if each ray of light was a tether pulling her back to a life she no longer recognized as her own. Joe stepped out of the car first, the cool morning breeze fluttering his jacket as he reached back to help her into the light. When she stood on the gravel, she seemed so small against the backdrop of the ocean, a delicate figure wrapped in a coat that was too large for her. She didn't let go of his hand. Instead, she pulled him into a hug that felt like a person clinging to a life raft. Joe buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize the physical sensation of her presence so he could carry it through the week ahead. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, a fast rhythm that only slowed when he whispered that everything was going to be different. She looked up at him, her face framed by the silk scarf, and told him she finally felt like she could sleep without the lights on because she knew he was waiting. They stood there for several minutes, two silhouettes etched against the coastline, as the world began to wake up. Joe watched her walk back to her Thunderbird, her steps hesitant as if she were leaving a piece of her soul behind. She rolled down the window one last time and blew him a kiss, her eyes shining with a promise more binding than any contract she had ever signed. Joe raised his hand in a silent salute, watching the red taillights of her car disappear into the winding mountain road until the sound of her engine was replaced by the crying of the gulls. He stood there long after she was gone, the yellow note still pressed against his heart, feeling a profound sense of purpose he had thought was gone. Throughout the following week, Joe moved with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He looked at the calendar on his wall every hour, counting down the seconds until Saturday, August 8th. He began to plan the details of the ceremony, thinking of the red roses he would buy, and the quiet life they were about to claim. He believed he had witnessed the beginning of their real lives, a future where Norma Jeane would finally be free to grow old in his arms. As he drove back, the radio played a soft melody that seemed to harmonize with the hope singing in his blood. He even stopped at a small jeweler, looking at a band of gold that he imagined placing on her finger in just a few short days. If this story of a love that never gave up has moved you, please share it with someone who believes that true devotion can survive even the darkest nights. We believe that stories of such unwavering devotion deserve to be told. We are coming to the part of the story that changed everything, and we want you to be there with us. The silence of that Sunday morning was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the air out of Joe's lungs. He was sitting in his kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling on the table, and a calendar circled with the date of the following Saturday, the day they were supposed to be married, when the world outside suddenly turned into a cacophony of sirens. The frantic knocking began just after 9 o'clock, a desperate pounding that made the porcelain cup rattle. When Joe opened the door, he didn't see the bright sun. He saw the ashen face of a friend whose eyes were wide with a shattering truth. The news didn't come as a whisper. It arrived like a physical blow to the chest, a headline that screamed across the television and froze the hearts of millions. She was gone. The woman who had promised to meet him at the altar had passed away in the quiet of the night, leaving behind a world that never knew how to save her. Joe felt the floor beneath his feet tilt, the reality of the small house in San Francisco shattering. He didn't cry at first. He simply stood there as the sounds of the neighborhood faded into a dull roar, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket of his jacket where the note lived. Inside that pocket was the yellow scrap of paper, the 12 words she had written with such desperate hope just days before on the foggy coast. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling so violently the paper rustled like a fallen leaf, and he read the words over and over until they blurred into a smear of ink. The realization that she was no longer with us hit him with a cold, hollow finality, a sense of betrayal not by her, but by a universe that could be so cruel as to offer heaven before slamming the gates. He thought of the white dress she had described, the one that would now never feel the sun, and the wedding day that would instead become the day the world said its final farewell. The promise had taken on a new meaning. She was no longer asking him to wait for a car ride, but to wait for a reunion that would take place beyond the veil. Joe retreated into the shadows, closing the curtains against a world already turning her passing into a media spectacle. He sat in the dark, clutching the note to his chest, feeling the weight of a promise he was now forced to keep alone. The man who had been the king of the baseball diamond was now just a broken soul, realizing his greatest victory had turned into his most profound tragedy. If you remember where you were when the world lost its brightest star, please share your story in the comments. We are a community that honors these deep human connections, and your words help us heal as we remember the woman behind the legend. We are entering the most sacred part of Joe's journey, the years where he proved that true love never truly ends. The tall, somber man stood before the cold marble of the crypt, his shoulders hunched as if shielding a flame from a gale. While the rest of Hollywood was busy turning a heartbreaking loss into a carnival of flashbulbs, Joe DiMaggio stood in absolute silence, fulfilling the first day of a commitment that would outlast the century. He looked down at the bouquet in his hands, 20 long-stemmed red roses, their petals vibrant against the pale gray stone. To the public, this might have seemed like a theatrical gesture, but to Joe, it was a quiet response to a question asked on a foggy beach just days prior. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the car, asking if he would still be there when the morning came. By placing these flowers, he was answering her, telling her spirit he was still waiting, just as she had asked him to do. He touched the surface of the marker, his fingers tracing the letters of her name, and for a moment he could almost smell the faint scent of her perfume in the air. He made a vow right there, with no cameras to record it, that as long as he had breath in his body, she would never be forgotten. The roses were more than just a gift. They were a conversation, a way to keep the line open between a man on earth and a woman who had moved on to the eternal. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, the delivery would arrive, a rhythmic pulse of devotion that signaled to the world that some bonds are too strong to be severed. People began to talk, whispering in the streets about the mysterious man who refused to let the fire go out, but Joe never gave an interview. He didn't need the world to understand that this was the only way he knew how to keep his side of the pact. He watched the seasons change and the years begin to stack up like fallen leaves, but the roses never faltered, remaining a constant reminder of a Saturday that should have been a wedding. In his mind, he wasn't visiting a cemetery. He was keeping an appointment with the girl who had promised to pack a single suitcase and come home to him. He found a strange comfort in the routine, the act of ordering the flowers becoming a sacred ritual that anchored him to the memory of her laughter. He would stand there sometimes for an hour, ignoring the wind, speaking to the stone in a low voice about the things they had planned. He told her about the house by the water and the quiet life they had missed. As the months turned into decades, the world moved on, but Joe remained a sentinel of a love that refused to fade. Little did anyone know his devotion was fueled by a secret object he kept hidden away from the prying eyes of history. In the quiet autumn of Joe's later years, a friend noticed him sitting on his porch, his fingers tracing the inner lining of an old, worn wool jacket, as if he were reading Braille. It was the garment he had worn that final night at the beach, a piece of clothing he refused to discard, a piece of clothing that seemed to hold a weight far heavier than the material. Tucked deep inside a hidden pocket, stitched into the heart of the coat, lay the yellow scrap of paper that had changed his life on a foggy beach in 1962. For 20 years, Joe had carried those words like a holy relic, never showing them to a soul. To the world, he was a stoic legend, a man of few words who lived a solitary life in the wake of a national heartbreak. But in the privacy of his home, he was a man living in a beautiful frozen moment, a man who read that note every single morning to remind himself why he was still standing on the shore. The friend watched as Joe carefully unfolded the paper, his hands now spotted with age but still possessing that same steady strength. The ink had faded to a ghostly blue, and the paper was as soft as silk, yet the message remained as vibrant as the night it was written. "Wait for me," it whispered from the page in her frantic, looped handwriting, and Joe would nod his head in silence, a silent vow renewed for the 7,000th time. He had never remarried, never sought the company of others. He lived his life in a gentle sort of waiting room, moving through the decades with a dignified grace that most people mistook for mere loneliness. They didn't understand that Joe wasn't lonely. He was occupied with a mission that transcended the physical world. He was the keeper of a secret flame, the guardian of a girl who had been misunderstood by everyone else but him. He saw the way the world continued to use her image, and it only made him hold the note tighter. He knew the truth that no biographer could capture, that she wasn't a tragic figure to him, but a woman who was coming home, a woman who had just been delayed by a very long road. He treated his life as a bridge, a stretch of time he had to cross before he could finally reach the destination she had promised him. The note was his compass, a steadying force that kept him anchored when the world felt too fast and too cold. He would often close his eyes and imagine the sound of her Thunderbird pulling into the driveway, the crunch of the gravel, and the way she would look at him with that tired, hopeful smile. He had spent 20 years preparing for a reunion that the world deemed impossible, but Joe knew better than anyone that a promise made at the edge of the sea is a promise that never fades. If this story of a man who kept a secret promise for 20 years has moved your soul, please share it. We believe that stories of such unwavering devotion deserve to be told, especially in a world that often forgets the power of a single word. We are approaching the final moment of Joe's journey, the day when the waiting finally came to an end. In the twilight of a hospital room in March of 1999, the man who had been a symbol of American strength for nearly a century lay perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. The roar of the stadiums had long since faded into a hum, and the frantic pace of the world outside mattered very little to the 84-year-old hero who was finally reaching the end of his longest game. His breathing was slow and rhythmic, like the steady pull of the tide on that beach so many decades ago. Those standing by his bedside noticed a sudden change in his expression. The lines of sorrow and the weight of 37 years of waiting seemed to smooth away in an instant. Joe DiMaggio wasn't looking at the doctors or the flowers. He was looking toward a light that had been flickering in his heart since that night. In those final moments, he wasn't thinking about his records or the fame that had chased him. He was thinking about a yellow scrap of paper and a girl in a silk headscarf who had once told him to wait for her. He had kept his end of the bargain with a devotion that defied logic, standing as a sentinel for a love that the world tried to turn into a myth. As the heartbeat monitor slowed, a faint, genuine smile touched his lips, the kind of smile a man wears when he finally sees a familiar car pulling into the driveway after a very long journey. He whispered his final words to the silence of the room, a soft confession that he was finally going to see her again, and with that, the tension left his body. He didn't leave behind a legacy of statistics. He left behind a testament to the fact that the soul never forgets a promise. The 12-word note, "Wait for me, I am coming home to you, I love you, Norma," was finally being answered. The wait for me pact was finally being fulfilled. Not in a house by the water or a quiet wedding in 1962, but in a reunion that no headlines could reach and no cameras could disturb. For 37 years, he had carried the roses, the note inside his jacket, and the memory of her laughter, and now he was simply stepping across the threshold to meet the woman who had been waiting on the other side. The world mourned the loss of a legend, but those who knew the secret knew that this wasn't a tragedy, it was a homecoming. Joe had spent half his life in a state of quiet anticipation, and as he closed his eyes for the last time, he did so with the peace of a man who knew exactly who was waiting for him. The story of Marilyn and Joe didn't end with a headline. It ended with two souls finally finding the harbor they had been searching for. Their love remains a reminder that the most powerful things are the ones we cannot see, the promises kept in secret, and the devotion that survives the conclusion of a life. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't found in the bright lights of history, but in the quiet promises kept in the dark. If Joe and Marilyn's story touched your heart today, please hit that like button to help us honor their memory. For more untold chapters of Hollywood's most enduring legends, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment. Thank you for being part of our community. And remember, true love is the only legacy that never fades.